Congressman Hill, thank you for joining us today.
You bet. Great to be with you, Danielle. Thanks for the invitation.
Arkansas faces big challenges, from economy and healthcare to agriculture and national security. Looking at all of these, what do you see as your top priority for the state if reelected?
Well, I think first the economy is what people are concerned about. I think the cost of living is plaguing a lot of our families from top to bottom. The prices at the grocery store, prices at the pump, prices of housing, all these things have run up because we had a 40-year high in inflation coming out of the pandemic. After really 2 decades of benign inflation, people weren't used to seeing shocking price increases to their property and casualty insurance, their rent, the grocery store. So that's why I've introduced the Price Stability Act that makes inflation the top policy focus of the Federal Reserve to lower interest rates. And it's why here in Congress, we're trying to lower the budget deficit. This year, the budget deficit will go from 2.3 trillion down to 1.6, 1.7 trillion. That's the right direction. We put a real priority in lowering spending across the board because the combination of loose money from the Federal Reserve from the pandemic and Joe Biden's $6 trillion in extra spending triggered that inflation. So number one is fighting inflation. And I've also introduced bills to lower the cost of housing, like my 21st Century Housing Act, which the House will take up in the coming days. So I think that's number one. Number two, I think you're right. National security is a big issue, and border security is national security. So the fact that we've secured the border was an important campaign promise we made in 2024, and making sure that the U.S. has a strong military that we can lead in peace through strength, whether it's in East Asia with China or in Europe against Russia.
America faces challenges at home, abroad, and right here in Arkansas. When you look at conflicts overseas, should the priority be the U.S. leading the world or fixing problems to home, closer to home first?
Gosh, I think since the founding of our republic 200 years ago that you have to do both. You've got to stay focused on the domestic challenges, and you've got to be focused in making sure America is kept safe, our homeland is kept safe by our leadership abroad. So I think it's important to do both. That's why I emphasize that growing the economy through focusing on cost control, lowering inflation, improving jobs, lowering taxes on working families, that's important in the domestic economy to make sure our economy grows and we have that opportunity. But it's also important that we do lead in resolving conflict around the world. That protects our homeland, big picture. And of course, the Western Hemisphere is one of the most important places to us in our homeland, which is why President Trump has put an emphasis, along with the Congress, on the drug cartels operating out of the Caribbean and out of Mexico.
With wars continuing in Ukraine and the Middle East, Americans are questioning how much the U.S. should be involved overseas. Where do you believe America's responsibility begins and ends when it comes to funding and military support?
Well, I think let's start on the issue of Europe, because President Trump has certainly made that a priority. Since President Kennedy, every American president has complained that the Europeans are not doing enough in their own defense against the Russians, formerly the Soviet Union, through NATO. And when I say defense, I mean both spending military, recruiting military-age personnel, standing armies, as well as their defense supply chain. And over the decades, they've become more dependent on the United States in that supply chain and that armed force. And this is beyond the nuclear policy of protecting Europe with our nuclear shield. So I think Trump is right to ask the Europeans to make a 5% contribution of GDP towards building their own defense supply chain. We want to be a partner there. We are an instrumental and in a critical partner in that transatlantic defense of Europe. But the idea that the Europeans would be the tip of that spear with their own militaries, their interoperative militaries with the United States, and interoperative supply chains, I think is important. And I think they've let that, Europe, have let that atrophy. Putin's illegal invasion of Ukraine was a huge wake-up call there. So my view would be we should be in a key strategic supporting role to that front-end force. In the Middle East, you mentioned the Middle East, There we have an indisputable partnership with Israel as the only democracy in the Middle East. But we also, through that partnership, have now defeated the largest terrorist influence in the region, which is Iran. And that defeat has defunded Hezbollah in Lebanon and Syria, Hamas in Gaza, the Houthis in Yemen, and put them on their back foot. What's the benefit to American taxpayers? In my view, it's because Saudi Arabia, the Emirates, and Israel will now build a partnership to keep that area in check. And that's why the president's goal from the previous administration of the Abraham Accords is so key towards peace in the Middle East and a reduction in American military or treasure support at the level it has been for the past, 2.5 decades, which is significant, since the war on terror and since 9/11.
Political violence and threats against public officials remain a concern nationwide. What responsibility do elected leaders have, including members of your own party, to lower the temperature even when political stakes are high?
Right. Well, during my years in Congress, I have always worked mightily to model good behavior of speech and respect for others through speech with civic dialogue, whether I'm at home or on the floor of the House of Representatives. I think it's essential. And I've called out members of both political parties when I think they overstep that line. The secret to our American democracy is for us we can disagree and we can fight about policy direction and we can fight about spending levels, but we need to do that in a respectful way. Bill Bowen, my old boss at Commercial Bank here 30 years ago, said we can disagree without being disagreeable. And that's a hallmark, I think, of how we should be carrying on our debates in the Congress.
Many Arkansans support President Trump's hardline approach towards Venezuela and the Maduro regime. Do you believe President Trump's actions strengthened U.S. influence in the region, and would you support similar measures if you were reelected?
I do believe that President Trump's emphasis on building partnerships in the Western Hemisphere is critical. The Western Hemisphere, since the horrible tragedy of 9/11, has taken a back seat to American foreign policy as it relates to concerns over East Asia's threats by China against Taiwan, the continued threats of Russia, or the war on terror in the Middle East. And that's been challenging. And we've left, in my judgment, our neighborhood behind. Trump's emphasis on stopping the cartels, which have killed 100,000 plus people a year through the fentanyl, money laundering, has, I think, been an important change in American policy, and I support it. Maduro has a bounty on his head going back to even the Biden administration and before, and was indicted in U.S. courts. And so President Trump extradited Maduro to the U.S. to face trial. I worked for President Bush, George H.W. Bush, Bush 41, at the time that Noriega, who was the ruler in Panama, had annulled an election, threatened U.S. forces and civilians there, who was also indicted in the United States for money laundering and drug crimes, and he was extradited to the U.S. So I believe, from my travels in Central and South America, that this new form of American leadership is good, stopping transnational crime. We're doing that with partners. I don't think that's always covered in the media. Our partner countries support these efforts. Secondly, countering China's malevolent, both military and economic colonization of South America. This is countering that, which I think is important to U.S. national security and our economic security. And for those two reasons, I think President Trump's engagement both in the Maduro extradition, but also partnerships across the region has been positive and will be positive for U.S. trade and economic and national security purposes.
Congressman, something that might be considered insider baseball, is this actually about China? Because now we know that we control the oil in Venezuela. Is that a way of disarming China potentially? Would that make it more of a military move than necessarily drugs?
No, I don't think so. I think what you have to recognize from Hugo Chavez's takeover of the country in the 1990s to his deputy co-conspirator in his dictatorship and authoritarian government, Maduro, in both those instances, they were doing business with Russia, Cuba, Iran, and China, giving them a base of military and surveillance operations in the United States. And don't forget, Russia's a major oil exporter, one of the biggest in the world. Iran's one of the biggest oil exporters in the world. So I don't think that that was the governing point. I think it was being a thorn in the side of the United States in the Western Hemisphere to create a base of operations there, supporting Cuba, the communist government in Cuba. And it is part of China's strategy to infiltrate Western Hemisphere wherever they can. Strategic minerals in Peru, strategic minerals in Chile or Argentina, oil in Venezuela, true. But this extradition of Maduro is about countering drugs and increasing national security safety, both in the Caribbean and in the hemisphere. The oil is about benefiting Venezuela. It's been stolen now for 25 years by the regime. This is about getting it back on the market, back functioning, and let those revenues benefit the citizens of Venezuela. I think that element that alleges the United States did this to, quote, control the oil, I think that's a false narrative.
ICE enforcement has drawn protests from both sides of the aisle saying ICE are violators of civil liberty, but at the end of the day, they have a job to do that they're ordered to do and are met with increased violence. We've seen the lives of law enforcement threatened as well as civilians while they are performing their function. What's your stance on ICE law enforcement? Obviously, we've had some tragedies that have occurred,
right,
specifically in Minneapolis.
Right. Well, I think law enforcement have a high responsibility to try to, in conducting their operations, do it in a safe way, considering the public surrounding those efforts. And so I was pleased to see President Trump send Tom Homan to Minneapolis to study the management of ICE and Customs and Border Patrol there. Were they doing it right? Were they targeting the right people? Were they using the right tactics? Were they operating in the right manner? And so I appreciate the changes that Tom Homan is making. I think that's right. This is an executive branch responsibility to do that. And I'm horrified by the loss of life there. And I've called for a full and fair investigation on that. I was really pleased to see Chairman Garbarino of our Homeland Security Committee announce the day of those terrible shootings that he would investigate that in the Congress. But with that said, and we all know this instinctively, there is a supremacy clause, and you make the point that ICE has a legal responsibility to carry out their operations, and Governor Walz and the mayor of Minneapolis have an obligation to cooperate with the United States government in that. It should be cooperative. It should be planned. It should be thoughtfully carried out. And I was also pleased to see Tom Homan reported that they've made progress on that. You should not be encouraging civilians to disrupt a civil law enforcement operation. You're asking for trouble. And therefore, I think both sides need to take that responsibility. And I really encourage civil authorities to cooperate with the federal authorities for public safety. And that will facilitate, Daniela, a First Amendment right to protest. That needs to be done in a safe, effective way that doesn't interfere with the actual operations that are undertaken. And people need to respect that. I believe very strongly in that First Amendment. Let's have a arranged public protest if people want to do that. But it became unsafe in the Minneapolis context, and it's a horrible tragedy.
President Trump keeps making statements that he supports the Iranian people and has previously said multiple times that help is on the way. What does that help look like, and does that involve Congress, and what can Congress do? Mm-hmm.
Well, Congress has had the toughest sanctions regime against Iran over the years I've been in Congress. In fact, one of my bills was signed into law by President Biden that publicly announced how much money the Iranian leaders, the mullahs, the IRGC, the Ayatollah have personally stolen from the Iranian people. It's amazing to me that a cleric, the Ayatollah, has, according to Reuters, $1 billion net worth. So we've put on sanctions. We destroyed their nuclear situation, their nuclear development process. That's the most important, I think, to the safety of the American people in the Gulf. We've taken out IRGC leadership. President Obama did some of that as well. But you cannot coddle Iran. So when I'm concerned that President Trump, would overpromise in this instance, because the Iranian people have to be supported, I think, through sanctions, through neighbors and allied nations putting pressure on the Iranian government that have diplomatic relations, that they have got to facilitate, a different way of governing that country. And I think America is leading in that pressure. Every year I speak to the Iranian expatriates who want their country to be taken back by the people. And so I've encouraged that. So in summary, tighter sanctions. We just put additional sanctions on Iranian oil. But if we want to get at the heart of it, and I'm considering a bill on this, there are people who facilitate the financial transactions with Iran, and I believe we need to sanction them. And I think that's going to be controversial. But if we want to get at the heart of it, I think that's an important next step.
Who are those people?
Gulf states like the United Arab Emirates and others around the world. And President Trump's made a lot of progress on Russian oil. India announced last week, the president had gotten them to announce publicly that they would begin to drop their purchases of Russian oil. They're the largest probably buyer of dark shadow fleet oil from the Russians. 80% of the oil from Iran that is produced is bought by China. Very hard to sanction China, but can we sanction the people who facilitate those money transfers? And so I believe that sanctions and international pressure and combined work and the Abraham Accords all puts pressure on a change in government in Tehran that could lead to a better place for the Iranian people.
Previously, for that regime, the U.S. had been involved for the Islamic Republic to come about. You've mentioned that the Iranian people need to fulfill this. The majority of the strength for regime change would come from them. U.S. involvement, would that potentially lead to another erroneous regime coming about, you think?
Well, this is why I think the way to, if you do it with the neighbors putting pressure and diplomatic pressure, from what I have learned from talking to Iranian expatriates who've been separated from their country since 1979, the intellectual academic community is prepared to return to Iran and provide a leadership there that's not a theocracy. We're not trying to impose a governmental form there, but is there a voice of the Iranian people that could lead to a different government that was not a theocratic klepto state? And that's very similar, philosophically to, I met 45 minutes with the leader of the opposition in Venezuela. And their affection is that over the few months, once stable, that they'll hold elections and that those 8 million Venezuelans that love their country will go back to Venezuela, which is a wealthy, successful country with a great history of, as you know, over its history of democracy and pluralism, not, in the recent past. So I think, it's not about us imposing something. It's about creating, can there be conditions in Iran that would facilitate a more pluralistic, non-theocratic government?
I'm back to ICE. DHS recently has advised using body cameras to ICE officers after public concern over enforcement tactics. Should body cameras be worn and required nationwide for all ICE operations, do you think?
I think that's a good practice. That's a practice that we do in our civil society with our local police departments. The Homeland Security bill that Senator Schumer has shut down actually fully funds body cameras for ICE officers.
Some say the Minneapolis situation reflects federal overreach. Others say ICE is just doing their job. Mm-hmm. How do you balance strong immigration enforcement with civil liberties and community trust?
Well, as we talked a few minutes ago, I think it's important to protect the First Amendment right to assemble and ask for change in government practices. But the number one issue that's in conflict here is that the state of Minnesota and the city of Minneapolis has not planned and coordinated the ICE enforcement operations in their jurisdiction. I don't see this kind of behavior and risky public behavior in New Orleans or Memphis or Washington, D.C., where there have been similar operations conducted. And so at the heart of it is, yes, protect people's rights to assemble, speak their views about targeting deportations and things of that nature, but it's critical that this sanctuary city approach not exist. I mean, the U.S. government has the right to do this. They have a supremacy clause, and I do support the U.S. Targeting the worst of the worst for ICE identification. But that has to be done within the law and using the right practices, the right management, and creating the right environment. And a lot of Americans are dissatisfied with what they've seen in Minneapolis on the part of both ICE and ICE leadership, which is why Donald Trump has changed leadership. The person was dismissed who was leading the ICE operations, and now Tom Homan has taken ICE and Customs and Border Patrol, put them under one command, moved 700 officers out of the city, and is, in his view, targeting the operations in a much better way. And Mr. Holman has also said that he's getting better cooperation from the state of Minnesota, and I think that's important. And that's what the American people are essentially asking for, is transparency, following the right procedures, and Congress is going to do a fair evaluation and investigation of just what led to the two tragic deaths and whatever errors may have been made. But under no circumstance should we as citizens let off the hook the important responsibility of civic leadership in Minneapolis and the governor there. And I would remind listeners, calling federal law enforcement officers Nazis is probably not a very smart thing to do. And in fact, the Holocaust Museum in Washington just last week renounced that and named Governor Walz as somebody that they, I'd say, criticized, I won't say condemned, criticized significantly for his use of that. That's an over-the-top approach, and it's created, I think, civic strife. And when you combine that with no boundaries on protesting, then you're going to create a tragic situation.
So just to further that more, when cities and states resist federal immigration enforcement, is that a failure of leadership at the local level, or does Washington share responsibility for
Well,
not
I think
fixing?
I've answered that question quite clearly. There are both the federal law enforcement operation and the local government share responsibility there. But when you abandon your responsibility locally, and we saw this in some of the instances in the summer of 2020 following the horrific, tragic killing of George Floyd, it takes both sides to defuse this and operate in an effective, safe way for the American people in any given jurisdiction. And so it's a shared responsibility, but you cannot incite your citizens to attack federal law enforcement. And some would argue that's been the case in Minneapolis.
During the Obama administration, more than 3 million people were formally deported, often with cooperation from state and local governments. Why do you think that cooperation has become more controversial today, and is immigration enforcement now more about politics than policy?
It's Danielle, it's a very good question, and to see that evolution over the past decade is something I've thought a lot about, and I don't have an answer to your question. In the 1990s and the 2000s, there was, in both political parties, a strong belief we needed a strong border. We wanted a vigorous legal immigration system, in fact, a better legal immigration system. And I have voted to reform the immigration system several times during my time in Congress to resolve some of this conflict, including how to seek asylum. We have a law on how to seek asylum, and it was not being followed, for example, by the Biden administration. So it's puzzling to me why some in the Democratic Party have no longer support a secure border or immigration enforcement in our country, compared to a Chuck Schumer of the 1990s, a Bill Clinton in the 1990s, a Barack Obama in the 2000s, who agreed that we had a consensus. We want a secure border. We want a vigorous legal immigration system for seasonal workers, ag workers, tourism workers, construction workers. And we want to not allow people to just cross our border willy-nilly, illegally, trafficking people, drugs, or committing crimes in our country. I would hope that we can get back to the center where Democrats will join Republicans in a sensible immigration reform and a sensible way of not demonizing border security and immigration enforcement.
Inflation has cooled, but many Arkansans say prices still feel painfully high. What do you say to families who hear economic indicators are improving but don't feel it in their own wallets?
Right. It's because when President Trump was sworn into office and Republicans in both the House and Senate, and we began working together, we inherited a real mess after 4 years of Joe Biden. In an earlier answer, I walked you through how too loose monetary policy at the end of the pandemic, which I criticized at the time, and too much spending by Joe Biden in 2020 and 2021, coming out of the pandemic, some $6 trillion in new federal programs, created a 40-year high in inflation. And once that hits, it takes months and sometimes years to bring that inflation down, and yet people are still shocked by that price level increase. So a house costs more, their mortgage rates went up, their property and casualty insurance went up, the prices at the grocery store went up. And in the past 1 year, though, we've gotten some moderation in grocery prices. We've brought fuel prices down. Trump is fighting like heavily to bring down drug prices through his negotiation to get drug prices down. I've introduced my Price Stability Act to get the Federal Reserve focused on reining in inflation. We've brought federal spending down, which will contribute to less inflation in the future. And I've introduced two bills, I think, that are directly related to lowering costs.
What are those
That's
bills?
The 21st Century Housing Bill I mentioned a few minutes ago. It lowers red tape for constructing houses, improves zoning, gives cities the incentive to broaden their zoning, and it removes burdens cities have on how they encourage home building. And secondly, my Main Street Capital Access Bill opens up lending, capital, and reduces costs for community banks. Our community banks under $10 billion make 60% or so of all the 1 to 4 family construction loans in this country. And so bringing down federal spending, focusing on inflation at the federal level, bringing down regulatory costs. Our tax bill that we voted on last year that people are reaping the benefits of now saw a doubling of the child tax credit. No tax on tips, no tax on overtime. Car interest, if you buy a new or used car, is deductible for some families. No tax for Social Security for about 8 out of 10 seniors in Arkansas. But so taxes, regulations, spending, these are all things that will tackle that issue that all of our families are confronted with, which is high inflation. And we're doing our part to undo 4 years, I think, of bad policy.
Arkansas ranks as the most food insecure state in the nation, with nearly 1 in 5 households struggling to put enough food on the table. What would you do in Congress to tackle food insecurity and help families provide for their families?
Well, first, I think the things that we've done that enhance their take-home pay is number one. If families have more income, they become less food secure. And so rising real wages after inflation is a very important component to all families in our state. So we estimate that preventing a large tax increase in 2025, which the Democrats all supported the tax increase, and doubling that child tax credit, removing taxation on tips, overtime, lowering taxation on allowing a deduction for auto interest, for example. All those things will produce pre-tax income gains for our citizens, and that's number one, is to have more earnings. Secondly, I think the bringing down food costs is important, which is why I have not supported across-the-board tariffs. You and I have talked about this before in our days of knowing each other. I don't support across-the-board tariffs because I think while they don't necessarily contribute to permanent inflation, in any one moment they can have a price level increase. And we don't grow bananas in the United States, so why would you tax bananas, as an example? Tariffs as a negotiating tool, okay, to get the other country to change their policy, but putting them at a high level and leaving them on, I think, can hurt families, and that's why I was pleased to see the Trump administration make sure that tariffs in that grocery store basket were withdrawn or reduced significantly. So, I think higher real wages is a key component. Bringing down inflation costs for food is a key component. And then making sure the state works with the federal government on a really good supplemental nutrition program through the USDA, the SNAP program, is at the margin. All those things are helpful to food security. And our cities are doing a great job at trying to remove food deserts. And I want to commend a company like Dollar General, who has worked with the city of Little Rock, North Little Rock, Pulaski County to try to infill any kind of food desert location with fresh fruits and vegetables and I see it when I travel Arkansas. I see the work companies like Dollar General are trying to do to provide more nutritious food available at more spots around the state.
On the topic of we don't grow bananas in the United States, question one and then a follow-up to that. Do you think that we should do more insourcing in the United States, growing our own fruits and vegetables? And then follow-up to that, farmers are struggling to do this. They're facing continued rising input costs, shrinking margins, and unpredictable markets. If reelected, what specific legislative priorities would you push?
Yeah. Well, let's take the first question about supply chains. I don't think we should try to grow things that we can't grow here. So, but on strategic supply chains, in strategic minerals, that is something that we can do. And Bruce Westerman from Arkansas, our congressman in South Arkansas, is a leader on this. I'm a leader on it in my committee because I oversee the XM Bank and the Defense Production Act. So Bruce on permitting, on strategic mineral mining and processing, our committee, Financial Services, on using the XM Bank as an investor and the Defense Production Act to target supply chains. I think reshoring some critical elements like pharmaceuticals and defense elements are important here, and the Trump administration's made that a priority, and so has the House and Senate. And then friendshoring, where in the Western Hemisphere that we talked about a few minutes ago, tremendous source of all those fruits and vegetables in those countries, plus strategic minerals in Peru, Argentina, Chile, Mexico, all are partners of the U.S. where we can create a friend-shored supply chain in the Western Hemisphere. So the answer to your first question is, Absolutely, we should, and we are taking steps to do that. On your second question about farmers, before I was in Congress, I was a banker, and I was the CEO of a bank in South Arkansas for 15 years that was a major agricultural lender. I know firsthand what our farmers are going through, and it's not good. This is starting the fourth year where our farmers here in Arkansas will not produce a profit in aggregate. Why? Weather is a big component. We've lost a couple of crop years either to too wet late springs and flooding or a similar problem in the autumn. So we've had weather concerns in planting or harvesting the crops. The war in Russia drove up all prices on fertilizer and component parts, and that really has not changed. And then we've had prices due to market competition around the world that have not really gone up. A pound of coffee, a bushel of beans that are at the same price as decades ago. So as you point out, costs are up, revenues are normally not bad, but they haven't advanced beyond that cost basis. And then interest rates have been up too since the Biden inflation. We have had a spike in Chapter 12 bankruptcies in Arkansas for farm bankruptcies, and I'm very concerned about it. What I'm doing in Congress is, first of all, I voted for the big, beautiful bill last year that reformed the reference prices for our crops. It was hailed as a victory by the farm economy, whether you're in the Mid-South or up in the upper Midwest. I am supportive of President Trump's emergency payment that he made through the USDA after we passed the appropriations bills. And finally, I support John Bozeman, our senior senator, and G.T. Thompson from Pennsylvania in getting a House and Senate farm bill passed this spring. And I think that is the most important thing coming out of this government debate about the Homeland Security funding that the Congress can take up in the next month. What do we need? We need those bills passed. We need that financial support for our farmers because of these unusual conditions, but we also need the luck of a better planting season this year for our farmers.
Jump to this real quick before we get too far off. Housing costs and mortgage rates have locked many first-time buyers out of the market. What role can you fulfill to help first-time home buyers?
Well, first-time home buyers, the age has moved up because of the Biden inflation pushed prices up dramatically in the last 5 years. And prices are now softening a bit after that 5-year run-up. So I'm hoping that we see some flattening out on this spike from the Biden inflation on house prices. That's number one. Mortgage rates have come down a bit from their peak, and I think you'll continue to see that. So our 21st Century Housing Act that I promoted, plus our Banking Act, provides more capital and more ability for banks to make home loans, home construction loans, and our 21st Century Housing Act also lowers the costs and provides incentives to lowering the cost of constructing housing. But there's no silver bullet here, Daniela. You have a lot of factors that make this complicated. But I remember it well. I bought my first house and mortgage rates were 10%. 10%. Not 6.1%, 10%. And my down payment, I remember saving for it. I remember getting an adjustable rate mortgage that was in the sixes back in those days. So I know what it's like to save and be waiting for that low interest rate and waiting for that house. But I think the trends are right. And again, this is another example of us trying to undo some of the mistakes from the Biden administration. But I do believe the outlook for housing is better in the coming year.
Congressman, you are a tech-savvy guy. Let's talk about AI. Artificial intelligence is advancing faster than anyone can keep up with. What concerns you most about AI? Is it job loss, misinformation, national security, or are you for it?
Well, I'm for the use of artificial intelligence. It would be a mistake to be against artificial intelligence. It's a tool. It's going to increase productivity. It's going to make both families and business and government potentially more effective, more successful. And so I like new technology tools that help me do my job more effectively. So I would urge all Americans to think that artificial intelligence is a good next step in technology, number one. Number two, there should be a human in the loop of using artificial intelligence. If you're going to use AI to rank customers for a mortgage application, it's still the decision of the bank and to demonstrate they're in compliance with federal law and that they've made a good decision. It's not the AI's decision. The AI is an analytic tool. So I'm a big believer in this concept of human in the loop. I don't consider that a cliche. I think that's actually how you use it. Just as you would have said, I'm using in 1995, hey boss, I'm using the internet to do my research. Okay, well, you're responsible for the research. So AI is similar from that point of view. What am I most concerned about? The enhancement of AI for criminals to do bad things. For the normal, under a normal circumstance today, the chance of doing a fraud or doing something misleading or, as you point out, misrepresenting is higher. And that does have national security ramifications and social ramifications, not just from propaganda, but from having money stolen from you. So I advise citizens all the time, be alert to frauds and scams. Our state attorney general, Tim Griffin, who's doing a wonderful job, is also focused on frauds and scams, and AI can make that worse. So that's something we're very focused on in the House Financial Services Committee, stopping frauds and scams, debit card, credit card, checking, theft, or AI, cyber, or IT type theft, working with the administration on that.
What are some regulations that you think you could put in place if reelected to prevent this from going further?
Yeah. Well, first, in financial services, we've been meeting. In fact, we talked to the Treasury Secretary in our hearing this week about this. How do we set out the rules of AI? First of all, to use AI effectively to oversee banks and brokerage companies, because you can use AI as a screening tool. But secondly, how do we regulate how they use it with their customers? So that's what we're doing. We're looking at the regulatory oversight of financial services. How do we use AI to do the oversight, and how do we use it to protect consumers from a malign fraudster? And that is an all-of-government approach that we're doing. I think the FCC, Federal Communications Overseer, should do that also as it relates to cell phones and texting and things of that nature. So there's a lot to be done there. And then states, as I noted with my comment about Tim Griffin, I think states' attorney general are very focused on this as well. So there's a role for state and federal government there. But my takeaway is AI is going to be an important tool, but we want to keep a human, in the loop.
Rural hospitals and clinics across Arkansas are struggling or shutting down. If reelected, what role should the federal government play in preventing healthcare deserts in rural areas in Arkansas?
Yeah. Well, I spent a lot of time on that in my 8 counties of central Arkansas. All my hospital and medical services are generally associated with a hospital system from Unity in Searcy to obviously the big companies here in Little Rock like CHI and Baptist, for example. But I do have one county hospital that's independent, that's Ozark in Clinton, Arkansas, and they're doing quite well. I met with them in December. I asked about how I could be supportive of them. They gave me a very solid report on their patient service and their services that they're rendering. And the federal government has given a $50 billion fund to states to extend rural care and care partnerships. And Arkansas is going to get $207 or $8 million in that rural care. And I met with leadership at UAMS just last week about how they thought Governor Sanders, UAMS, and the hospitals would collaborate on that. I was very impressed with the approach that they've taken. Other federal resources that are important, though, are our community health centers. We have federally supported community health centers. We have 173 of them in Arkansas. They are a principal place for primary care across this state, including prenatal and maternal health. And they are an essential part of that fabric between our hospitals and our private doctor practices, and obviously our payers like Medicaid and Medicare.
To the Epstein files. You are someone who we've repeatedly talked to. You express your interest in transparency, government transparency. The Epstein files have been released, and many voters, many citizens are concerned that even though they have been released in the full, they are majority blacked out. Do you think that fully releasing these documents would restore public trust? And they also say that, you know, in this push for transparency, is it a push for transparency even if it implicates powerful or well-connected people?
Well, I think that's at the heart of it. The American people have insisted on, I think, trying to expose the whole Epstein saga after the fact, because he preyed on financial networking with the wealthy and powerful and translated that into a horrific underage sex trafficking operation. He's a sick guy. So I've been for releasing whatever people want to see. It didn't, you know, the fact that there's some conspiracy against releasing documents is just not, I don't think that's fair or accurate. I think that is a social media assertion that is not fair or accurate. Federal courts protect people's privacy in grand juries. And let me make a hypothetical example. Let's say Jeffrey Epstein got his hair cut every month by the same barber, right? Fair point? Is that possible? That barber would have been interviewed by the FBI. Tell me all about what you know about Jeffrey Epstein. Did he ever ask you about blank? How often did he come in? Did he pay you in cash? Did he use a credit card? Who did he talk about? Did he talk about this person or that person? Is that a possibility? Sure it is. Do you think the barber's information should be released to the public? And I'm asking a rhetorical question. I think a lot of people would argue, well, no. I mean, no. Well, it will be. So the argument that some of that stuff is redacted still, to use the legal term like blacked out, is because of things like that. Or people still under investigation. Because the Department of Justice does thousands of interviews, millions of pages and hours with an eye to, can we use this to convict Jeffrey Epstein? Can we use this to find someone who's a co-conspirator of Jeffrey Epstein that we can also indict? That's the purpose of that investigative process. And what people have demanded, and now they've gotten, is millions of pages of stuff that potentially, you know, could violate a completely innocent person who just was interviewed in the grand jury investigative process. So some of that is still maintained as a redaction, but that's pursuant to federal court rules. It has nothing to do with the Congress, and no one is directing them to, in my judgment, I'm an opinion, giving you an opinion like an American citizen here. This is not, you know, an orchestrated effort to hide something there. And what's more evidence of that, of releasing all these photos of famous people. And the final comment I would make, Trump's only been in office a year. And the Democrats allege that this is all about uncovering Trump's malfeasance with Jeffrey Epstein. And yet Joe Biden had these files in his Department of Justice for 4 years, right? So I think that it's being done. And Jamie Comer, who's the chair of our oversight committee, he's released more documents than anything that had ever been released during the Biden administration. So I think people should recognize there's a bipartisan effort led by citizens to release Epstein files, and they're being released, and the chips are falling, you know, where they may on that topic. And I've supported the release of those documents and voted to release those documents.
Side note to that, former President Bill Clinton has been publicly linked to the Jeffrey Epstein files, and it is due in court. What do you have to say to that?
Well, I think he and Mrs. Clinton have agreed to an on-the-record, under oath hearing with the Congress. This has been going on, I think, with Jamie Comer's committee for many, many months now. This is just the end of it. And based on what the committee has said, Mr. Epstein visited the White House 17 times, and Mr. Clinton or Mrs. Clinton flew on the Epstein plane for several times. So there's some connection there that led to why they wanted to visit with the Clintons, and they've agreed to do it. So let's see what happens.
How do you respond to voters who are still deciding whether you truly represent their priorities?
Well, I grew up here, and I have every day for the years I've served in Congress fought for the benefit of Arkansans, for better jobs, better careers, more access to education, try to lower health care costs, try to lower the ravages of inflation. The worst tax on the American people is inflation. And we did not have inflation for a couple of decades after the global financial crisis in 2008. And unfortunately, Americans woke up in 2021 to the horrors of inflation, and I've made that a key component. I spent my life in finance, helping people save money, start businesses, help farmers get the money for their crop. So I believe I've spent my life dedicated, to my home state of Arkansas, to helping life be better here. And so I would urge people to continue to support my efforts to improve conservation, improve the economy, improve people's lives here in Arkansas. And I work hard every day to do that.
And really quickly, I know that you are an advocate for veterans and veteran care and veteran housing. Anything new coming up for you this year? Well,
I've devoted myself to helping our veterans here. We have about 50,000 veterans in Central Arkansas. I've gotten more services at our VA hospital here. I've gotten more support for Camp Robinson and our Little Rock Air Force Base along the way. I've taken great pride in the work I've done for them. I've gotten almost $100 million back for veterans here in earned benefits that they had struggled to try to get out of the VA system. And really a crown jewel of the work that I've done over the past decade is bringing Fisher House to Arkansas. And I really appreciate your personal interest there. This was something that our veteran families really needed. And since it opened in November, we've had about 50% of our rooms taken, and we've saved thousands of dollars for spouses, moms, dads, kids, all during the holidays and in these terrible winter months, of being able to stay right on campus and be with their veteran citizens. So it's been a privilege for me to help our veteran families, and it's the least we can all do for those who put on the uniform.
And finally, if voters are choosing between continuity and change, how should they decide who will fight harder for Arkansas when the cameras are gone?
Yeah. Well, I'm by definition a fighter. I'm an entrepreneur. I'm a business person who started a lot of businesses, fighting for customers every day. And I went into this fight because I was so despondent during the Obama administration on snuffing out the wet blanket over the American economy of too high taxes and too much regulation. And I've continued that fight every day. And now that fight is bringing lower taxes to the Arkansas families, lower regulatory burden on our community banks that make those home loans, and getting our federal spending under control so that we can have lower interest rates to make it easier to buy a house. So my whole nature is, both in the years I've been in business as well as in government, is fighting for the best outcome, the most conservative outcome we can get for our citizens.
Congressman Hill, thank you so much
You
for
bet,
joining
Danielle.
us.
Great to be with you. Thanks for the time.